There is one very simple fact about the FRACTAL Terra. It sucks at cooling. If you want low noise and high performance cooling, don't get the FRACTAL Terra because that's not the ITX case for you. It's mostly form and not really function. And while it can support some of the highest end hardware on the market, it can't support their cooling requirements because FRACTAL was focusing on the vibe. And I can't blame them for it. It's still one of the most beautiful PC cases I've ever laid eyes on, and I still am in love with it a year and a half on. It's still my daily driver, and I still want it to be. So what do? I can't just ditch this case that I love. I'm gonna figure out how to fix that cooling. And the solution, I think, is what I've come up with. The most high airflow, air-cooled FRACTAL Terra, I think, on the internet. Now, quick disclaimer, this is heavily inspired by this build I saw on Reddit. I was inspired by it because he basically put in a metric butt ton of Noctua fans in his FRACTAL Terra and called it a day with amazing cable management. And well, I'm not doing everything the same. It's pretty obvious that I'm heavily inspired by this build. Let's start with the specs because the specs in here are pretty good and are pretty hot, so they need some decent cooling. The GPU is a 4070 Ti Super because it was the cheapest GPU I could get at the time that had 16 gigs of VRAM, and NVIDIA because I was going to be doing CAD and rendering stuff, so I needed that. It also has a 9800 X3D, which requires relatively decent cooling, and 64 gigs of DDR5 6000 MHz Corsair RAM, all powered up with a Thermalright SFX 850 power supply. Let's start with the build, starting with the general airflow plan of this case. So, because this case is going to be put in the back left corner of my table, up against a wall, a cabinet, and a monitor, I couldn't really have a heavily negative airflow layout because, well, while it is more optimal for cooling, I do not want to be pumping hot air out onto the wooden desktop below. I do not want to be pumping hot air out against the wall where it's going to bounce around and recirculate back into my case. I do not want to be bouncing hot air out against my monitor because it's an OLED and OLED shouldn't be exposed to heat. And so I needed to do a more positive airflow layout with an exhaust at the top, so all the hot air just rises and gets out of the way and wafts around my room rather than staying around the rather enclosed space that doesn't have particularly great airflow. Hence, we have an intake on the CPU side, an intake on the GPU side, and the bottom also being an intake with the top being the only exhaust. Which is where we're going to start with the fans. Now this looks like an inline 4 engine. It isn't. It's a row of 4 Noctua fans that entirely bankrupted me and the 3 future generations of my children. We've got 4 40mm Noctua fans here. 3 of them are the thicker 20mm ones that have more pressure and better airflow, and one of them is the thinner 10mm one since I needed to create some clearance for the GPU power cable. Also on the top here we have an Arctic P12 Slim that is acting as an exhaust, although it's really only pulling hot air from the front of the GPU and the power supply. But every little helps. If you're wondering how this is mounted, it's mounted via a 3D printed bracket that I bought from this seller on Etsy. I paid absolutely way too much money on it, and I paid absolutely way too much for the shipping for it, but I didn't have a 3D printer or 3D printer skills back then, so that's a shame. The process for installing this bracket was super duper simple, and if you want to add a row of fans to your FRACTAL Terra and you don't want to 3D print or design one on yourself, this is actually a pretty decent product. Go support him. Now on the GPU side of things, we have the RTX 4070 Ti Super. In particular, this is the Gigabyte Gaming OC because it was cheap and what I could get my hands on. But there is a problem with this generation of Gigabyte cards. The thermal paste is susceptible to press out, aka the thermal paste will spread out too thin and smear out and just become not effective over long-term usage. And considering this GPU is going to be vertically mounted, in this case, it's actually even bigger of an issue since the thermal paste just is going to be pulled down by gravity. Thankfully though, we have the beautiful PTM 7950 phase change material. I swapped that out for better long-term performance, and that's probably why the GPU temps dropped by 3 to 5 degrees Celsius, even without any other of the mods. The next thing I did do though was to deshroud this GPU. The stock fans are horrible, they're weak, they're not that great, they're a little noisy, so I replaced them with 2 Arctic P12 Slims. I didn't have enough clearance because of the CPU cooler I was using, so I had to use slim fans, but preferably I would use thick ones for actual real gains in performance. The P12 Slims are perfectly wide enough for the GPU, so that's quite fitting. And there are going to be improvement in terms of sound if they're not an improvement on performance. To further improve their performance though, after cable tying them down to the graphics card, I added tape meant for basically venting air. This is like aluminum tape people use on air conditioning units or airflow duct units, for example. And basically, I sealed the edges of the fans so that they had a basically airtight mount to the heatsink, so no static pressure could escape around the sides, and all the fresh air that's being sucked in the case by these fans will be forced through the heatsinks. I even taped off the parts of the fan that weren't pressed up against a heatsink so that none of the static pressure could escape through the path of least resistance. I'm not entirely sure if this actually improves cooling performance, but my friend, who was an engineer and knows something about fluid dynamics, assured me that this actually does improve static pressure. So if you disagree, tell me in the comments. The next thing I did do was add foam gaskets to these intake fans on the graphics cards. There's a little like 1-2 millimeters space left. So adding these foam gaskets, usually meant for air conditioning or HVAC units, enabled me to create a flush seal between the fans and the side panels, meaning they're not going to recirculate any hot air that might be lingering in the case, and they're going to have maximum static pressure focused on sucking air from outside the case that is fresh and cool and good for cooling the GPU. This, however, does introduce an issue with resonance, which I still haven't been able to address. Moving on to the CPU side of things, and we have like a dense-ass motherboard. I removed all the silver glossy stickers that this motherboard comes with because I wanted a straight flush black look that I thought was more industrial and more cool. And the RAM also had to have the heat sinks removed because the CPU cooler just wouldn't be able to overhang over the RAM if I kept the original RGB dim coolers. As for the CPU cooler, to cool the 9800X3D, I have a Thermalright AXP120. I didn't like the color of the OG fan, even though it's a perfectly adequate fan, so I swapped it to the Arctic P12 Slims. Also, I did put the same foam gasket tape thing on the other side of the fan so that it also has a flush kind of suction airflow tube to the side panel of the case. This should hopefully further improve cooling. And yes, the CPU has PTM 7950 on it because we're going all the way for cooling performance and I wasn't going to risk it with crappy thermal paste. As for the power supply, nothing crazy was done here except custom cables. Some of the cables were custom made, but most of it was actually cut from the original cables. And the reason is pretty simple. The Thermalright cables were actually thinner in terms of their wiring than the ones my friend brought. Yeah. And as a result, it was a better idea to just use the stock cables cut to length. It does mean I don't have any backup cables, but frankly, I don't care. On the bottom of the case though, I added 2 more intake fans. These are Arctic P12 Slims, and you might be like, well, they're not on the inside of the case. Yeah, they're on the outside. And the reason is simple. I just don't have enough patience to cable manage, cut it up, and do a bunch of things to the case so that I could fit 2 P12 Slims in there. So slamming it on the outside was a far simpler solution. But you shouldn't do this to your FRACTAL Terra unless you plan to lift up your case, because really there isn't any clearance on the bottom of the case for these Arctic P12s to breathe unless they've been propped up. So thankfully I've got these 2 3D printed black feet that allow me to prop up my FRACTAL Terra in a very nice aesthetic way, improving the airflow, allowing these intakes to breathe and making it actually functional. And with that, that's pretty much the whole cooling setup. So did it work? Well, of course it did. I spent 2 months calculating things, ordering parts and planning this. You think it wouldn't work? Even if all the cooling performance improvements came from the PTM 7950, I would still have been happy. But the cooling performance here is far superior to what it originally was. To understand how much of an improvement it is, I need to break down how bad the thermal performance was in this case. Keep in mind, this case is in a bad airflow area. It's real-world usage that I'm testing it in. I ran Cyberpunk for 3 hours with a fan speed on auto, and the fans basically never once went below 80%. It was that noisy, and even then, I suspect it was thermal throttling because I basically had average temps of 95, 98 degrees Celsius on both the CPU and GPU, which was just not good. After all the mods, with the fans limited at 50%, which was much more reasonable, the thing was running perpetually at 100, 105 degrees Celsius, 90, 95 degrees Celsius, and it was definitely thermal throttling. Because now the performance was about 40% slower than when the fan speed was on auto. So what about the mods? Well, after the mods, running on auto, meaning these fans were allowed to ramp up as and when they want, meaning this new config was actually a little noisier than the stock one since there's so many more fans. The thermals were insane. The GPU never went past 80 degrees Celsius and the CPU never went past 75 degrees Celsius on this config. Do note, I actually heat cycled this rig on off with benchmarks and stuff to make sure that PTM 7950 was properly activated. And the FPS also was improved with automatic fan settings by about 5%, meaning it was thermal throttling in the stock configuration. But what if I limited it to 50% fan setting? With 50% fan setting, it's not as quiet as the stock config on 50% fan, but it was still significantly quieter than the full newly modded config on auto, as well as the old stock config on auto. And, well, the thermal performance isn't quite as good, obviously, but it still was plenty fine. Running with a limit of 50% fan speed, the GPU never once exceeded 90 degrees Celsius and the CPU never once exceeded 85 degrees Celsius, which meant it wasn't thermal throttling and I wasn't getting insane amounts of noise. I am very happy with its performance overall. All in all, would I say this is worth it? If you can 3D print your own bracket, definitely this is a worth it mod to consider. I mean, Noctua fans are expensive, custom cables are a hassle, and adding so many fans and 3D printing stuff takes time. But if you really want to make a FRACTAL Terra work, and you don't want to do some crazy water cooling external loop thing, or run lower end hardware, this might be a serious thing to consider. So was it worth it? Absolutely yes. It was 2 months of planning, calculating, and me learning a lot of new things, but it was extremely fun and the thermal improvements were massive. I will be less concerned about longevity, less concerned about noise, and I'm just happier with my PC overall. Don't subscribe. I'm deleting the channel.